I'm excited to be sharing with you all this morning on the topic of what does it look like to overcome the overwhelm in our life. So, something that I've observed even before all the chaos of 2020 is that life is complicated, right? You don't need me to tell you that. Life is complicated. But another observation that I've made is the choices that we make can either make our life more complicated or they can simplify our life. So the choices we make are extremely important. And earlier this year, I published a book called Finding Simplicity, Learning to Live Like Jesus in the Midst of a Complicated World. And that book was birthed out of a season when I studied through the book of James with a group of people in my church, and we were studying through James. And as we were studying, the Word of God was just so practical to what I was learning and what we were walking through. And it was so powerful that I knew I needed to write about it, because this message that God was speaking in me on how to find simplicity and how to move away from chaos and complication was something that other people needed to hear. But little did I know that I was just at the very beginning of my journey of learning about what it means to find simplicity, and God used the book writing journey for me to teach me so much. So what I want to share with you is 5 top tips to find simplicity or to overcome the overwhelm in our lives. And all of these are biblical principles found in the book of James. But as I start, I want to make the point that simplicity begins when we live like Jesus. If you study through the Gospels and you look at Jesus' life, you'll find that he did not have an easy, problem-free life. Sometimes it's easy to think, oh, the people in the Bible, they lived in a different day and time. If they face what we face, maybe it would be different. But if you look at the situation Jesus was born into, right from the get-go, you see that Herod the king tried to eliminate his life and killed the lives of many innocent young boys in order to eliminate Jesus' life. The country that he lived in, his Jewish people didn't even have full citizenship, and they were underneath the rule of another government. There was chaos and political riots and all of that going on. Not to mention that once Jesus began to teach, everywhere he went, there were thousands of people sometimes following him. Can you think of how overwhelming it would be if you always had hundreds, even thousands of people following you that wanted you to fix all their problems and heal them? But something about Jesus, if you observe in the Gospels, he was always patient. He was always kind. He was always loving. I love how John Ortberg says it, that Jesus was often busy, but he was never in a hurry. Jesus had a simple way of living life. So ultimately, we find simplicity when we learn to live like Jesus. And what I love about the book of James is it's such a practical book of the Bible. It basically says, if you do this, these good things will happen. If you don't do this, these things will happen. And it sets us up with this straightforward advice that teaches us to live like Jesus lived. So the first key point I want to share with you is we find simplicity when we see our challenges through God's perspective. That's the theme of this Shaken Not Stirred event, is keeping our eyes not on the things that are seen, that are right in front of us, but on the things that are unseen. We talked about in 2 Corinthians 4 how there's an eternal weight of glory. There's something heavier. There's something greater. That's what's happening right in front of us. But as long as we're focused just on the seen, we're always going to be overwhelmed. So we have to learn how to see what's happening on our lives from a different perspective. In the book of James, chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, James says this: "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect work, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So there's this concept that James starts off with: consider all things joy. All things, James? Should we consider COVID joy? Should we consider the chaos that's going on, the rioting? Is that the personal problems we have? How can you say that all of that is joy? And what James is not saying is that every situation and circumstance itself is a good thing, But what he's saying is you can find joy no matter what you're facing because God is doing something greater than what you can see. And James points us to God is developing our character. God is working something in us that's greater than what we can understand or comprehend. And, something that I've had to come to grips with is my plans for my life and God's plans for my life are often very, very different. My plans are often this agenda of where I want to be, how much money I want in the bank, the number of people I want to teach, help, do this, the position at work. But God's goals for my life are about my character. How loving am I? How kind am I? How patient am I? How do I treat other people? What am I doing for his kingdom? And God takes the hard things in our life and uses those to shape us into the person that he wants us to be. 2019 was an extremely challenging year for me personally. 2020 has been a hard year, but 2019 was a personal hard year for me because I had to face a lot of the things that were going on inside of me. God basically turned me inside out, and I faced maybe no major trial, but lots of small trials, but externally, but internally, I faced major trials and major turmoil. But through it all, God kept reminding me of these words from James. Consider it all joy when you face these trials, Amber. I'm doing something. You have to switch your perspective. You have to see what I'm doing. Let me give you one example. About this time last year, I traveled to Nicaragua, and we had a long trip back. And after delay, spending a night in an airport, we finally got home. And a few days later, I contracted pneumonia. And I was sick. I didn't have to go to the hospital, but I spent weeks in bed with a fever, and it took me about 8 weeks to fully recover. I missed weeks and weeks of work and lots of time. And, in that, I was asking God, why? Why would you do this? I have all these things that I thought you called me to do on my plate and things that I want to do to serve you better. Why would you have me get pneumonia? And God challenged me to start asking a different question. Instead of asking why, ask what. God, what are you trying to teach me right now? And, I can't tell you exactly what God wants to teach and mature in you, but I know in that season, when I asked God, okay, what are you trying to teach me through this pneumonia? He said, or showed me, that he wanted me to see that the world does not fall apart when I'm not in it. He still is in control. Everything keeps going on. He's still working, and he doesn't need me to have it all together and do all of these things because he's God with or without me. And I needed to remember that, and I needed that lesson. So God used that season to put me down in bed and remind me that life is not about what I do for God or what I do for other people. It's much more important to know him and develop relationship with him and people and love well. So that's just one example of how God can flip our perspective. So if you want to find simplicity, you have to change your perspective and see things the way God sees them. The second thing I want to share with you is we find simplicity when we take responsibility for our actions. So one of the easiest traps to fall into is the blame game. There is always something or someone to blame for what's going on in our lives and how we react. We can blame our family, our boss, our situation, our finances. If only you knew what was going on, you would understand why I did this or acted this way. But when we play the blame game and we push responsibility out to other people, we will never find inner peace. This puts us in this place of internal chaos and turmoil because we never actually deal with the problem. James 1 deals with this in verses 14 and 15, and I'm going to read it from the Message. It says, "The temptation to give in to evil comes from us and only us. We have no one to blame but the leering, seducing flare-up of our own lust. Lust gets pregnant and has a baby, sin. Sin grows up to adulthood and becomes a real killer." When we make bad choices, we are the only ones to blame. We can't blame God. We can't blame the people around us. We can't blame the things that happen. If I'm angry, bitter, whatever it is, I fall into addictions, ultimately it's because of the choices I make. And if I try to deflect that to others, I'm never going to find healing. And that's right where the enemy wants us. We just heard a great lesson on the lies of the enemy. Let me share a quote with you from Warren Wiersbe in his book, The Strategy of Satan. He says, if Satan can get you to believe a lie, then he can begin to work in your life to lead you into sin. This is why he attacks the mind, and this is why we must protect our minds from the attacks of the wicked one. The enemy wants to get into your mind and my mind and make us not deal with things. He wants us to be bitter and angry at God, bitter and angry with other people. And when we fall into these lies of the enemy and we let these patterns of sin into our lives, it destroys us. And it takes us on that path again to complication and chaos. But when we choose to be honest before God and take personal responsibility, we take the steps to freedom and simplicity that our lives need. Look back to the very beginning of time. Adam and Eve, they fell into the pattern of sin. So Satan put this idea in their mind and they thought about it and then they acted on it. And when they began to act on it, they fell into sin and they broke their relationship with God. And every thought we think may not be a sin, but if we let those thoughts fester and we let them build over time, they're going to come out in negative ways in our life. And the only way to get rid of that negative behavior is to call it what it is, take responsibility, and make a change. So the third way I want to talk about how we can find simplicity is when we choose love over judgment. This is so powerful. Look at our world around us. There is so much judgment and pointing fingers. You think this way, you said this, you're on this side, and everything is polarized, right? And we want to point fingers and blame other people, as we were just talking about, and make these assumptions about where people are. It reminds me of a few years ago, I was driving through Starbucks, right? I had a busy day and I wanted some coffee, which I'm not an everyday coffee drinker, but I needed a little something to keep me going between things. So I zipped through the drive-thru at Starbucks. And as I was sitting there, the person in front of me, I was looking at all their bumper stickers. They're one of those, the whole car decorated with bumper stickers. And I was looking at them and I started to think in my head, man, if this person knew what I believed, they wouldn't like me at all, because we obviously have very different viewpoints. And I put these negative thoughts in my mind about this person. So then I get up to pay for my coffee and the person at the drive-thru tells me, oh yeah, the man in front of you paid for your coffee. And I was so convicted in that moment. And this is when I was writing my book, Finding Simplicity. And I was reminded immediately of what I had been writing about from James chapter 2, about showing prejudice. See, I did not know that man, and I made these assumptions, and he actually did something very kind for me. So while I was judging him, he was showing me kindness. And in James 2, James addresses the church, how they're showing prejudice, and he gives them one solution, and it's very simple. James 2:8, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The solution to the prejudice in that church was to show love. The solution to the judgment you have in your life is that you show love. Love breaks down barriers. In Luke chapter 10, where Jesus gives us this command to love each other, it's immediately followed by the story of the Good Samaritan. That story where there's this man who's hurt and the religious leaders pass by. The ones who are supposed to help people and love people, they just pass by and refuse to help. But then the Samaritan, the one who the Jewish people hated, where there was animosity, where there was every reason where the Samaritan should have just passed by, he stopped and he helped the man. And Jesus uses that example. Love your neighbor as yourself. Your neighbor is the one who's not easy to love. The neighbor is the one on the other side from you that has the different opinions, that looks different, that thinks of life different, that maybe has hurt you before. But ultimately, if you want to simplify a situation, introduce love and take away judgment. So the fourth key about simplicity I want to share with you is we find simplicity when we take steps of faith. James 2:17 says, faith without works is dead. So if we want to have an active, vibrant walk with God, we have to have active faith. So I cannot say, I follow God and never obey what God says. I have to be active and I have to be engaged in growing in my faith. I love what A.W. Tozer says. He says, if I ask God for something I can do for myself, I'm dishonest in my praying. And I can tell you so many times when I've been stuck spiritually, when I've been going in this cycle and I can't get out of it and I wonder what's going on, it comes back to God showed me something and I refuse to do it. And I have to tell you, I would love for God to just open all the doors for me and do all of the work. But the truth of what the Bible teaches is God expects us to act in faith, and our faith opens doors. Let me share with you another biblical example. The story of Joshua is one of my favorites in the Bible. In Joshua chapter 1, Moses has died and Joshua is put in a position of leadership. And God challenges him to be strong and to be courageous and not fear. But in verse 3, God says something to him that I find to be very interesting. It has really challenged me in my faith. Basically, God tells Joshua, every place that your foot will step, that's the place that I will give you. And when I was studying this section in Joshua, God showed me if we want to see God work, we have to take a step. So for Joshua, he was going to go and lead the people in the promised land. But if he didn't step onto the land, it wasn't going to be given to him. He had to take a step and God would do it. So in the next couple chapters later, they go to part the Jordan River and they have to step into the river and then the river parts. And I wish it was the other way. Let me be honest with you. I wish it was I prayed, God worked, then I stepped out. But really it should be I pray, God shows me, I step out and God works. Often I found in life, I think that I'm waiting for God when truly God is waiting on me. He's waiting on me to do what he says. So when he speaks into our lives, we have to take active steps of faith. And when we don't do that, we're going to get stuck and we're going to be frustrated and we're not going to know what to do and we're not going to see open doors because we're not doing what God calls us to do. So if you want to find simplicity, you want to grow in your faith, be active and obedient to what God is telling you. And the last key point I want to share is that we find simplicity when we experience healing through community. In the last chapter in James 5, verse 16, James says this, therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. There is a direct connection to healing and community that the Bible makes here. Now, I've studied a lot of commentaries on this, and some commentaries will say this is a spiritual healing only. Some will say it's a physical healing. Some say that it's both. But what's not debated is the connection between prayer with others and community. So if we want healing in our lives, if we want breakthrough in our lives, we find it in community. When you isolate yourself, it builds barriers and it creates chaos and it creates pain. And there's not one of us that hasn't been hurt by somebody. So the thought of opening up to other people can be scary, but we have to find the people in our lives that we can share with. Rob Reimer in his book Soul Care says it this way, there is no freedom without honesty. There is no breakthrough without brokenness. You will not find breakthrough in your life without brokenness. And brokenness comes not just in experiencing what God is showing you personally, but it's in sharing with other people. Not that you have to share publicly with everybody, but there should be people in your lives that are aware of what you're struggling with and that help you walk through it. A couple years ago, I was a part of a women's event at my church, and we called it Breakthrough to Freedom. And as we were planning for the event, God put on our hearts this concept of we need to pray for freedom and breakthrough, and those of us that are leading have to lead the way in it. So we began to pray that God would give us freedom and show us things in our lives as we planned. And then that would happen for the women at the conference. And there was a group of women who shared in a panel. And I was one of the teachers. I wasn't a part of the panel. But as we were preparing for that panel, I spent a lot of time with these women. And what happened was many of them shared for the very first time publicly about an area that God had given them breakthrough. And they found that as they shared, they found even more freedom and breakthrough in their lives. And their vulnerability and honesty opened it up for the women at the conference to connect and realize, oh, other Christian women struggle with these things. I'm not alone. And in what seems like, oh, if I share that, it's going to make people judge me. And not that no one will, but the right people who are following God will not. What we think will make people judge us actually breaks down barriers and helps people connect to us and find freedom. So if you really want simplicity in your life, you cannot do it alone. You need God and you need people. That's how we're wired and designed. And so if you want to break through in your life, if you want to go to the next level, choose to do it with people. You need that community. So I just want to encourage you, simplicity is possible. Now, it's not something that we arrive at and we never have to work at again, but you can find it. But let me also say, it's not easy. You have to do the hard work. Easy and simple are not the same thing. So if you want breakthrough in your life, if you want to see God work, you have to be in His Word. You have to seek Him, and you have to let Him do the hard work, and you have to choose to do the hard work. But then you will find that you have that freedom and simplicity that only comes when we learn to live like Jesus. Thank you.